Okay, so we've been looking into these LA wildfires, and they're saying the damage is going to cost something like $150 billion.
Right.
It's getting pretty close to what Hurricane Helene cost, that tore through 6 states last year,
Right.
$250 billion.
Yeah.
And it just makes you think,
Huh.
could big oil be held responsible financially for these fires? And should they be?
Interesting question.
That's kind of what we're going to be diving into today. And we've got some really fascinating sources that explore this from a couple different angles.
Yeah.
So first, we'll look at the link between fossil fuels and these increasingly intense wildfires.
Right.
And then this kind of wild claim that big oil has been dodging taxes, essentially stealing money right out of California's pocket.
Okay.
So are you ready to explore how all these pieces might fit together?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's, obviously a complex situation with a lot of moving parts. But what I find really striking is just how much research there is now connecting fossil fuel emissions to how severe these wildfires are getting.
Okay, yeah, let's break that down a little.
Sure.
One of our sources points out this research that suggests emissions from the biggest fossil fuel companies are responsible for something like almost 40%.
Wow.
Of the forest damage we've seen in the western U.S. and Canada.
Wow.
We're talking about the last 40 years here, so a huge chunk of time.
Yeah, that's a really significant number, and I think it really underscores the impact, the long-term impact that these emissions have on the environment.
Yeah.
It's not just about the pollution we see right away.
Right.
It's about how all those emissions build up and change the climate over time.
Yeah.
And that's what's making these fires more frequent, more intense.
Exactly. And speaking of climate change, one of the sources uses this term hydroclimate whiplash, which sounds intense.
Yeah, it does.
Is it as dramatic as it sounds?
It really is.
Okay.
Basically, what it means is that we're seeing these huge swings between periods that are really wet and then periods that are super dry. And these swings, because of climate change, are getting more and more extreme.
Okay.
You can think of it like this.
Yeah.
Heavy rains come through, saturate the ground,
Right.
which leads to all this plant growth.
Yeah.
But then, if you get a long drought after that, everything just dries out.
Right.
And suddenly, you've got tons of fuel just waiting for a spark.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So California's forests are basically like this giant tinderbox just ready to ignite
Pretty much.
at any time of year because of these crazy climate swings.
Yeah, and that's not even taking into account, the role that humans play in all of this.
Right, of course.
Yeah, it's important to remember that wildfires, they're a natural part of forest ecosystems.
Yeah.
They've always been a part of these landscapes, for centuries.
Yeah.
But what humans are doing with climate change and, building further and further into wildland areas, it's throwing things way off balance.
Right. Yeah. So we're seeing more fires more often. They're burning hotter. They're lasting longer. And obviously causing way more damage.
Yeah.
It's a pretty scary situation.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
But let's switch gears for a minute.
Okay.
And talk about this whole tax situation, because I have to admit, I was pretty surprised to learn about the U.S. tax system. It's a lot more decentralized than what I'm used to.
It is quite different from, a lot of other countries.
Right.
I mean, in the U.S., both the federal government and the state governments can collect taxes.
Right.
So that means states like California, they have to rely on their own revenue to fund things like schools, roads, emergency services, everything.
Right.
And that's kind of where big oil comes into the picture.
Okay, so back in the 1980s, California was using this system called Worldwide Combined Reporting.
There you go.
It sounds pretty complicated.
Yeah.
But from what I understand, it basically meant that multinational companies, including big oil, they were taxed on their global profits, not just the money they made within California.
That's a good summary.
Okay.
Yeah, the system, basically, it looked at how much business a company did in California. So let's say a company earned $1 billion globally.
Okay.
And 20% of their sales, their assets, and their payroll were all in California. Well, the state would tax a portion of those global profits.
Right.
In this case, like $200 million.
Okay.
And it was, designed to make sure that companies were paying their fair share.
Yeah.
Based on, how much they were actually operating in the state.
Makes sense, but apparently Big Oil wasn't too happy with this system.
Right.
Our sources suggest that they, lobbied pretty hard to get it changed. And they finally got what they wanted with this thing called the Water's Edge election.
Right. And this new system basically said that companies could exclude profits that they earned outside the U.S. from their California taxes.
Okay.
And some experts believe that this change basically opened the door for companies to shift their profits, potentially, to subsidiaries in these tax havens.
Right, those places with, super low taxes.
Yeah, or sometimes even no corporate taxes at all.
So they basically found a way to avoid paying some of their California taxes. And we're not talking about chump change here.
No.
One source claims that this loophole cost California's budget up to $146 million every year.
Wow.
Imagine how many firefighters or new fire stations that money could fund it every single year.
Yeah, it really makes you think about what California could have done with that money.
Right.
Especially when it comes to things like preventing wildfires and dealing with them when they happen.
Yeah, especially considering that by 2024, the state was facing a $46 billion budget deficit?
Right.
Which led to some pretty major cuts across the board.
Yeah.
One source says something like $9 billion was cut from climate and clean air programs.
It really does make you wonder if some of that lost revenue
Yeah.
Could have gone towards lowering the risk of these wildfires.
Right.
Could have been used to fund programs, that tackle the climate change issues that are fueling these fires.
Yeah.
It's something to think about.
Yeah, definitely.
For sure.
And that brings us to the real heart of this deep dive, this whole fight for accountability.
Exactly. Yeah, we've seen how fossil fuels contribute to climate change.
Right.
And how climate change is making these wildfires so much worse. And then how these tax loopholes might have been helping big oil.
Yeah.
While California's budget and maybe even its climate efforts have been suffering.
Right. Right.
So I guess the question is, where do we go from here?
Yeah, that's the big question.
For sure.
So we've got this possible connection, right, between big oil's action, with the emissions and the taxes and all that, and this wildfire crisis that's only getting worse in California. But it feels like, there's a bigger issue here, right?
Oh, absolutely.
This idea of actually holding these powerful companies and groups accountable for the damage they've caused because of climate change.
You're right. That's a really crucial point. And what we're seeing now are all these lawsuits that are trying to do just that. Trying to hold these corporations and even governments responsible for how they've contributed to climate change.
And these lawsuits, they're not just happening in California or the U.S., right?
Right. It's definitely a global movement now.
Yeah, it feels like it's picking up steam everywhere.
It really is. Yeah, we're seeing climate litigation gaining momentum all over the world, and it's because people are realizing that the courts can be a really powerful tool to address climate change.
Right.
And force these people who've been dragging their feet to actually take action.
Okay, so let's focus on the lawsuits against big oil specifically. What are the main arguments that are being made in those cases?
Well, most of the lawsuits are claiming that big oil companies, they knew about the link between fossil fuels and climate change for decades. And instead of doing something about it, they actually worked to downplay the risks and mislead the public.
So it's kind of like what happened with the tobacco industry.
Exactly.
Where they spent years saying that smoking wasn't harmful, even though they knew it was.
Yeah, it's a classic tactic. Sometimes it's called manufacturing doubt.
Interesting.
You basically flood the public with misinformation, fund your own research that supports your claims.
Right.
And you make it seem like there's this legitimate debate when the science is actually really clear.
That's pretty cynical.
It is.
And in the case of big oil, it seems like the stakes are even higher, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Because we're not just talking about people's individual health.
Right.
We're talking about the future of the planet.
Absolutely. And these lawsuits, they're really digging into the specifics of what big oil supposedly did.
Okay.
For example, they're investigating whether these companies were funding think tanks and lobbying groups to spread misinformation about climate science and delay any real action on climate change.
It's like they were intentionally creating confusion and preventing any progress while they just kept doing business as usual.
Yeah. And meanwhile, the problem just kept getting worse and worse.
Right. And that's one of the main arguments in these lawsuits, right?
Yeah. That big oil's actions, directly contributed to us not transitioning to cleaner energy sources sooner.
Right.
And as a result, we're now facing these much more serious consequences from climate change, like these super intense wildfires.
So they're basically saying you knew the risks, you lied to the public, and now you have to pay for the damage you caused.
Pretty much, yeah. It's a bold claim.
Yeah, it is, and the potential consequences for big oil are huge.
Oh, yeah.
If they lose these lawsuits, they could be forced to pay billions, maybe even trillions of dollars.
It's a staggering amount.
Wow. What would even happen to all that money if big oil lost?
Well, most likely, it would be used to fund efforts to deal with climate change, both mitigating it and adapting to it. Think, renewable energy projects, building seawalls to protect coastal communities, maybe even helping people relocate from areas that are being hit hard by climate change.
Right.
It could also be used to compensate communities that have already suffered because of climate disasters.
It's almost hard to imagine the impact that could have.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
But of course, there's the other side of the coin too. What happens if big oil wins?
Well, if that happens, it's likely the taxpayers and governments,
Yeah.
they'll continue to be the ones who have to pay for most of the costs of climate change.
Right, so like the cost of disaster relief, rebuilding after wildfires and floods, the healthcare costs from heat waves and air pollution.
Exactly, yeah.
It just seems so unfair that the people who made all this money from the problem
Yeah.
wouldn't be the ones stuck cleaning it up.
A lot of people feel that way, and that's why they support these climate lawsuits. They see it as a matter of justice, of accountability.
Right.
If the companies that contributed the most to this problem aren't held responsible, then who should be?
It's a really important question, and it feels like these lawsuits are about more than just money,
Yeah, I think so too.
They're about forcing these powerful groups to face the consequences of their actions.
You're right, they're shining a light on this issue of corporate accountability and how much we need systemic change.
Yeah.
Even if they don't end up winning huge amounts of money, they're still raising awareness, changing how we talk about these issues, and empowering people to demand action on climate change.
So it's like a David versus Goliath situation, but it feels like something is really shifting.
I think so.
It seems like people are finally waking up to the reality of climate change and saying, enough is enough.
Absolutely. And these lawsuits, they're just one part of a much bigger movement.
Yeah.
This global push for climate justice. And that's actually something we're going to dig into more in the next part of our deep dive.
So we've been talking about these lawsuits against big oil.
Right.
And how they kind of fit into this wave of climate litigation that's happening all over the world. It's definitely a global movement, but I'm curious, what does that actually look like in practice? Are all of these lawsuits basically the same?
Well, it's a pretty diverse landscape, which I think is really interesting.
Okay.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach to climate litigation. Different cases use different legal strategies depending on the situation and what they're trying to achieve.
Gotcha. So give me some examples.
Sure.
Like, what are some of the different strategies being used in these lawsuits?
Well, some of them focus on human rights violations.
Okay.
They argue that climate change is directly violating people's basic rights, like the right to life, health, a safe environment.
So it's not just about some abstract environmental damage.
Right.
It's about the real impact climate change is having on people right now.
Exactly. And I think that makes it a lot harder to ignore.
Yeah.
These cases are saying, look, real people are suffering because of climate change.
Right.
And the people responsible need to be held accountable.
That's a powerful argument. Are there other approaches besides the human rights angle?
Oh, absolutely. Some lawsuits are targeting governments and corporations for not adapting to climate change.
Okay.
They're arguing that these entities have a duty to protect citizens from the harm that climate change is causing,
Right.
like sea level rise, extreme heat, stronger storms, all of that.
So it's not just about stopping emissions in the future. It's about dealing with the consequences that are happening right now.
Exactly. It's saying you knew these risks were coming, you had a responsibility to prepare for them, and you didn't, and now people are paying the price.
It sounds like these lawsuits are really pushing the boundaries of what's considered, like, legally actionable when it comes to climate change.
They are, and it's not just limited to governments and big corporations either.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We're also seeing cases that are using consumer protection laws. They argue that companies have been misleading consumers about how their products or services impact the environment.
Oh, so that greenwashing we hear so much about.
Exactly.
Where companies try to make themselves look eco-friendly without actually changing anything.
Right, and these lawsuits are calling them out on that. They're saying you can't just talk the talk, you have to walk the walk.
It's pretty amazing how creative these lawyers are getting with all these different approaches.
It is.
But what I find really striking is how many young people are getting involved in this movement.
Yeah.
It seems like there are so many stories about youth-led climate lawsuits in the news lately.
It's inspiring, right?
Yeah.
Young people are the ones who are going to be dealing with the worst effects of climate change.
Right.
And they're not waiting for adults to fix it.
Mm.
They're taking action themselves and demanding a future that is safe and sustainable.
It feels like their voices are bringing a whole new level of urgency to this fight.
I think so.
I mean, they're the ones who will inherit this mess, so their perspective is really important.
Absolutely. And their energy is contagious, you know?
Yeah.
They're showing the rest of us that we can't afford to be complacent.
Right.
We all have a role to play.
And that brings up a really important question. What can regular people actually do to support this movement for climate justice? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by how big this problem is and think that our individual actions don't really matter.
I get that. But it's important to remember that real change happens when we all work together. Every little bit helps.
So what are some concrete things that people can do to get involved?
Well, one way is to donate to organizations that are fighting these legal battles.
Okay.
These cases can be really expensive.
Right.
So even small donations can make a difference.
It's like crowdfunding for justice.
Yeah, exactly.
Putting your money where your mouth is and supporting these legal teams that are taking on these giant corporations.
Exactly. And another powerful way to contribute is by raising awareness.
Oh.
Talk to your friends and family about these issues. Share information online. Write to your elected officials.
Yeah.
Make it clear that you want action on climate change.
So it's about using our voices however we can to put pressure on the people in power.
Right. And don't underestimate the impact of your own choices. You know, reducing your carbon footprint, supporting businesses that are trying to be sustainable, advocating for clean energy policies.
Yeah.
All of that contributes to creating a more just and sustainable future.
It's a good reminder that we're all part of the solution here. We can't just sit back and wait for someone else to fix it.
Right.
We have to take responsibility for our own actions and make choices that align with the future we want.
Well said. And I think that's a good point for our listener to consider as we wrap up this deep dive. Okay.
It's not enough to just know about the problem.
Right.
We have to ask ourselves, what role do we want to play in finding a solution?
That's a powerful question.
It is.
It challenges us to get involved and become agents of change.
Exactly.
So to our listener, we encourage you to think about that question.
Yeah.
Explore these issues further, figure out what resonates with you, and find your own way to contribute to creating a more just and sustainable future. Because ultimately, the fight for climate justice is a fight for all of us, for the health of our planet and for the well-being of future generations.
Couldn't have said it better myself.